Well, thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be, back on this webinar with my sisters as a former research member, especially during these uh, unbelievable times that we're living in Lebanon. I was myself in Beirut when the explosion happened last week, and it's been really, we are having a hard time realizing what happened and reorganizing and trying to understand how to move forward from here. There's so much raging, despairing, protesting, lots of conflicting emotions. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because I think that it has a lot to do with the idea of, going beyond criminalization, and I'm going to talk about what kind of criminalization, but also how this relates to the communities that we live in, that we work from, and that we organize with. And so since the Port Beirut explosion that happened exactly a week ago, actually, we have seen lots of calls for the political figures and elites to be guillotined. And people protested on this basis, and they actually made that visible, whether through visuals, through social media, but also through slogans and chants. And what we have seen is an unprecedented, it was there before, but it's an unprecedented polarization between the ruling elite and the people. So there's this differentiation between us, the people, and the system as represented by its leaders. And here I'd like to make maybe two observations. The first one is to understand that this anger and this way of presenting things does not really come from a vacuum. We've been in an economic crisis that has lasted for months now. The currency has been devalued to 80% of its original value. Corruption is something that is, so embedded in the systems that it's actually, the warlords have been ruling for decades. And on top of everything else, we've also been dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic that I believe, we will talk about in this webinar as well. And so dispossession has become part of normalcy. And this is where there's a bit, it's kind of dangerous when what we expect is dispossession over and over again. And my second observation has to do with profit and people, and how we look at profit and people as two separate entities when they're not, because profit infiltrates. We cannot exist outside of profit. And the system itself, so it's about what kind of profit are we talking about? And the system works through its institutions as well. It's not just a system that exists there through its, political figures, but it has institutions. It's branched out everywhere. It's in the banking system, in the police, in the army, etc. And I think what I would like us to retain for this conversation is that this profit over people does not affect us all in the same way. First, because we are part of that system, and second, because we are outside of it, and at the same time, but in different ways and in different levels. And so the notion of criminalization, to me, is about justice systems and a judiciary that serve in general a certain class of people. And this notion has never been clearer as it is now in Lebanon. Yesterday, for example, the prime minister resigned, but the system itself remains intact. And so what's going on right now within the political elite is a mere response to potential international sanctions that would see their assets frozen, and their assets and bank accounts frozen, and their mobility reduced. And so it is ultimately about profit, as much as we would like to believe that it's also about the people putting pressure and the protests, etc. And so this calls, I would like to ask some questions here about who gets criminalized, who is held accountable, What kind of accountability can we expect in systems that are geared towards maximizing profit for a certain class of people? And all of this comes at the backdrop of a global context. So what we have seen in terms of the pandemic, in terms of Black Lives Matter, in terms of, defunding the police, have had also their repercussions in what we are living today. And I think the link here with SRJ, sexual and reproductive justice, is that prison abolition, the refusal of carceral, state-sanctioned criminalization, and punitive systems are about a vision of justice that we would justice that's transformative and that calls for community accountability ultimately. Now I know it's a bit hard to imagine, the ruling elite of, let's say, the Lebanese system willingly submitting themselves to an accountability process. But to me, it's also about a feminist revolutionary vision that goes beyond the corrupt systems that we are used to receiving from and that we live under. And to this end, maybe I'd like to talk about the three, or not the three, but three pillars of transformative justice and community accountability. The first one is mobility and borders. So SRJ is also about migration. What bodies are allowed passage? What bodies are allowed movement? And it translates, for example, in systems like the kafala system that is not unique to Lebanon, but that is also, regional and transnational in some instances. And so during the economic crisis, we saw migrant domestic workers in Lebanon being thrown out on the streets in the middle of a pandemic. We saw sex workers and migrant domestic workers asking to leave, to be sent back to their countries due to the economic crisis. And this is part of sexual and reproductive justice as well. The second pillar is about, working towards dismantling institutions whose purpose is to maintain corrupt systems. And maybe I don't think Lebanon is unique in that, but it's maybe a bit of an exaggerated, version, in the sense that each institution pretends to be working on its own. So the police would say that they have nothing to do with the banks would say they have nothing to do with the army would say they have nothing to do with the customs. Like there was this huge thing about who is responsible for what happened at the port, and at the end of the day it's like nobody is responsible because it's always somebody else's responsibility. And so this makes, so in that system, no accountability is possible. And I think the sanctity of these institutions, because, the police, the army, the banks are always seen as, symbols of national honor. And I think the sanctity of these systems have been challenged through first, the revolution that is ongoing and that has been ongoing for a few months now. I remember, for example, it's an anecdote, people were shocked during this protests back in November, December, that the army would not protect them. So they were still expecting to be saved from those institutions. From maybe a more legal slash, feminist legal perspective, there were new laws that have been passed in recent years, like the domestic violence law, rape law, etc. And part of the plan of these laws is to work with the police institution, for example, and create a system where reporting passes through the police. But today, it is that same police institution that is serving the interest of the ruling elite and that is shooting at protesters. I mean, it happened only 2 days ago on Saturday. And right now, because of what happened, we are under military rule because they declared a state of emergency for 2 weeks, which means that everything in relation to what civil society does, but also grassroots and grassroots initiatives has to pass through and get explicit permission from the military. And of course, this has incredible repercussions on sexual and reproductive justice, at least in the way we want to see it. And then the third pillar I'd like to talk about is about the macro and micro levels. We are not treated the same. I mean, this always seems to be not as important as, fighting the system, and its monstrosity, but it is in terms of, if we want to look at it from a sexual and reproductive justice perspective. And I want to go back to the idea of polarization, this ruling elite or profit versus the people. And maybe here I'd like to give the example of aid and who gets aid. It's something that we have seen in the past week. There have been calls not to give any aid to the government. And yes, please do not give any aid to the government. So NGOs and Red Cross institutions, but also grassroots initiatives have started fundraisers. But the way aid works is that there's somebody or there are communities that are always at the bottom of that aid. So, for example, some trans communities they put together a trans relief fund, and this fund was questioned, in terms of why would we fund trans people specifically, because the disaster affected all genders, and as a result, this fund was called a scam by some individuals. And so again, it is the idea that we need to start by recognizing that we are not treated the same by the system across the board. Migrant domestic workers have been, photographed cleaning after the explosion, cleaning the streets on their days off. Refugees donated blood. They sent, people to organize and help. And so this is there is a binary here, in that either they're seen as being at the bottom of the aid hierarchy and refused that aid, or they are thanked as if they did not belong to the the geopolitical context called Lebanon. And I'm giving those examples to talk about the idea of an alternative. We are frustrated that there is no alternative. There is so much anger at the ruling elite and their systems, and rightfully so, of course. But what alternative wants to work in such a system? How is it that we can, think of an alternative that would continue the work that is being done when we see the injustices that happen at different levels, whether at the level of the state or even at the level of how is it that aid, information, access, mobility function, and who is most affected by these pillars. And so we must organize with affect, but also maybe I would end with a plea to first look at our own movements, to practice accountability the way we want to see it, so we can hope to bring this worldview into our material realities one day.